What a difference a week makes. Lewis Hamilton, a bit embarrassing in the Australian Grand Prix by his own admission. Fabulous to watch today in China. Interesting day, gusty, new track surface, very difficult to get the tyres to last, very hard on the left front, lots of long corners in China. Great circuit in many ways, lots of demanding corners, very, very tough on tyres, very difficult to manage, particularly this crosswind. And Lewis Hamilton, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think he benefited a little bit from the last couple of years at Mercedes when he was having to adapt his driving just to try to get some sort of consistency with tyre temperature, often to get the tyre temperatures up, and was energizing the tyres as a result in a way that he never did in the first year when, say, 2022, when the Mercedes was not very good at all. And he's still driving that way. As I said in Australia, no signs yet really of Lewis doing that lovely early turn-in that he did so well prior to 2022 in the Mercedes and in the McLaren as well, and in Formula 2 and in Formula 3, GP3 I think it was. And here in Shanghai, I think on a day when it was quite difficult to get the tyres to work, it obviously found the sweet spot with Lewis Hamilton. And yeah, just brilliant to watch. There are two great corners in my opinion in China. One is turn 7, the left-hander 7th gear, almost flat, but not quite. Well, at the moment, it's requiring a lift on this track surface, just a slight feather. And it was interesting, I thought, that the only driver who was lifting just a fraction, almost in exactly the same way as the two McLaren drivers, was Lewis Hamilton, just after turn-in. Beautiful to see that. Whereas Max Verstappen, big lift. We'll get onto that in a second, and that's where he lost time in Sector 2 for sure. And we'll also do a comparison there between Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. The other really good corner in China, I think, very difficult corner, is annoying corner, probably is the right word, is the left-hander, the last corner of the lap, that left-hander where it's so easy, if you've got a good lap, to either brake too late or get the power on too soon or run too wide, catch the gravel, have a lose, do all those things that we've seen so many times. There's so many drivers. A very difficult corner to line up for too, I suspect. It looks that way from the onboards. And again through there, Lewis just fabulous, just like the McLaren driver, well, like Max and the two McLaren drivers, finding a throttle position that he just stayed with throughout the bulk of the corner and then just squeezed it through to maximum on exit. Whereas Charles was just sort of building up the revs a little bit more. And I wouldn't say it's a sign of uncertainty, but it was just so definite from Lewis through there. Just great to watch. No chance to use short corners on that bit of road. And interestingly, that's of course where Lewis had that famous moment when he spun out of the race in the pit lane in the McLaren days. And it was interesting to see that he did a similar thing in free practice one. I say free practice one was the only free practice this morning because this is a sprint weekend and this was sprint qualifying that we've been talking about. And he just went straight on, much too quick, and then came back onto the pit lane again, or the pit road again. And I'm wondering whether he was just practicing that to see how quickly he can go to that left-hander before he had to hit the anchors going into the pit lane speed limit. Probably thinking, yeah, I better not make that same mistake again. Anyway, he looked really good, and he looked really good on a difficult day, which I think says a lot about Lewis's touch and feel and the sensitivity of his inputs. And yeah, that's easy to say. I mean, 7 times world champion, we know how good he is. But it was interesting to compare him with Charles Leclerc, who, well, dare I say it, he looked as he often looks on a Friday. He looked not very good, very edgy, had one big spin, not an important one coming out of the hairpin, but he just never looked quite as svelte as Lewis Hamilton. It's about the only word I can use to describe it. Even though Lewis is using longer corners, Lewis's throttle work and his brake work was just brilliant, I thought, today. And I don't think there's any answer yet as to the way to use these tyres, because you could say with Lewis's longer corners than Charles that he may be energizing them more. But because Charles is making quite a lot of mistakes at the moment, it being a Friday, it's not really a fair comparison. We'll see tomorrow, I guess, when we get into proper qualifying after the sprint race, which begins proceedings tomorrow. Quite hot as well, so very on the edge with tyres. And a good example of that was Liam Lawson, who didn't even get out of Q1, didn't even look like getting out of Q1 in the second Red Bull, a car, as we know, almost capable of getting the pole, as Max proved in Q3. And that just shows how on the edge it was today in terms of getting the tyres to work. And Liam Lawson, a classic, late breaker, late turning, get the power on early, no other way he can drive. Amazing car control. And I'm assuming that's why Red Bull hired him, because he doesn't have anything like the same finesse as Sergio Perez in terms of power application, particularly out of medium and slow speed corners. Nothing like it. And he was just abusing the tyres. Every time he went out, he was way on top of the heat cycle of the tyres and never got it back. And I don't think that's to say how difficult and edgy the Red Bull is. I think it's just how difficult and edgy it was today in terms of managing tyres and getting the best from the tyres. And as I say, you could dig deep and you could probably say, Lewis probably did quite well today, or did very well today, because of the number of days he had like this in the Mercedes. And he ended up getting, a result from them. So, yeah, interesting, isn't it? That's we'll see. Max had a fairly desultory first practice, but from lap one it was very clear, and I don't think Red Bull are talking about this, but it was very clear to me, in my opinion anyway, that Red Bull are just thinking about qualifying in the race and making sure they've got all the tyres they need to do a great job in proper qualifying and then in the race. And it was significant, I thought, that he abandoned his quick soft lap, which was a quick lap. I mean, he was not far away from the McLarens in sectors 1 and 2. Then he just backed away and drove into the pits. This is right at the end of free practice 1, and didn't finish the lap, which is why he was way down the lists at the end of that. And that was saving the tyres. And then, of course, going into sprint qualifying, you have to run the first 2 sessions on medium tyres, and then you switch to softs for Q3. And again, as Max went out, the radio message came out, Max, think about 7, 8, 9, 10, conserving the tyres. We might need this set of soft tyres tomorrow, maybe Q1 tomorrow, who knows. So Max, a much bigger lift in the middle of turn 7. Now, whether that's actually indicative of where Max and that Red Bull is, I doubt. I think it's probably Max right. If I have a big lift in 7, I can enjoy myself 8 and 9. At least I've done my bit to save the tyres. He was slightly off in terms of 8, 9 and 10 then compared with the 2 McLarens. And he was quickest in sector 3. So that was where Max lost the pole in leaving margin. Now, it's not to say that he would have got the pole. He might have gone in some other way in the other 2 sectors. I don't want to detract from Lewis's drive, but that should be borne in mind. And it was interesting afterwards, Lewis talking about how great it was and the fans, how much he loves China, and I'm sure he loves the circuit. Complete opposite to Michael Schumacher, interestingly. It was the one circuit he never really got his head around. But Lewis has always loved China. And it's a great circuit, isn't it? That lovely turn 1, when even if you're not into short corners, you're going to have to use a short corner going in there. You're going to have to brake as you're turning in. But the interesting one overall, of course, is the performance of the McLaren, which looked as if it just didn't get the best from the tyres. Now, you could say, because it's, again, really slow on the straight here. I mean, we're talking 3.33 for the McLarens and 3.37, 3.38 for Red Bull and Mercedes, and the Ferrari is just a tad slower than that. So McLaren very slow in a straight line, which again suggests that they're running a lot of inherent downforce. Not running, they have an inherent amount of downforce compared with everybody else, which they can't actually get out of the car on a long straight. And although I've been talking about how difficult it was to get the tyres to work, there could be something else going on, although this must be seen to the backdrop of McLaren being very good on the medium tyre, so we shouldn't jump to conclusions. But here at the Chinese Grand Prix, a bit of a quick reaction from the Australian Grand Prix, the FIA announced the following going into the race. They said, having analysed footage from the rear wing deformations combined to the static deflections measured inside the FIA garage in Melbourne, the FIA has concluded that sufficient grounds exist for a tougher test to be introduced from the forthcoming Chinese Grand Prix on the upper rear wing. What that basically means is that the slot gap on the rear wing was limited to 2 millimeters. It's now limited to 0.5 with a tolerance of 0.25. And it could be that that has affected McLaren. It could be that's why they are a bit slower on the straight. Equally, as I say, we shouldn't forget that they were very good on the medium tyre. So the indications are that it hasn't affected them more than other teams, and it's affected everybody uniformly. It's just that on the soft tyre, things got a little bit out of control for some teams, some drivers out there today. But not for Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari, and not for Max Verstappen in the Red Bull either. So, yeah, good job by those 2 guys on the front row of the grid. Interestingly, it was Oscar Piastri who was the better of the 2 in that situation. I think because Lando overcooked the tyres a little bit in his sector 1, or maybe even in the build-up to the lap, following on from what he was doing in Melbourne. But Oscar got as good as you could get it from McLaren. Oscar got it. And then Lando a long way away, 0.3. And that was a lot of lurid moments of just no grip and balancing the car, obviously. But he didn't get the best from the tyres at all. And again, a bit like the Liam Lawson thing, it just shows how on edge it was today in terms of getting the tyres to work. So McLaren starting third and sixth going into the sprint. I don't think this is an issue for Lando in terms of his World Championship and how he feels as a racing driver. It could well be that Oscar Piastri becomes the sprint star of McLaren, who knows? And I'm sure Lando will be looking just to cruise around and get some points, hopefully top three tomorrow, but it won't be a massive issue for him. He'll be thinking more about how he's going to do that lap tomorrow in proper qualifying, and they're going to get on top of this tyre situation. Of course, the track will have more grip then as well. As I keep saying, it's a new track surface too. So, yeah, interesting day for McLaren. Just shows they're not unbeatable, and certainly given the variables thrown up by the conditions today and the Pirellis, then yeah, definitely beatable on the soft tyre, that is. So Charles Leclerc is scratchy fourth between the two McLarens, and then behind him George Russell just ahead of Lando Norris in the other McLaren. George not much quicker than Antonelli on the medium tyre. Kimi very good on the medium tyre. When they got to the soft, maybe the switch from medium to soft, maybe how difficult the softs were to get right. George opened up the gap then. He was 2 or 3 tenths quicker than Kimi on the soft tyre. But a good all-round performance from Mercedes. I suspect, given the way Ferrari have gone, Mercedes will be disappointed that they aren't up there with Ferrari, bearing in mind they had the measure of Ferrari in Melbourne. So, yeah, a difficult day. George, you know, one lap he had grip, one lap he didn't, and there was no logic or direction to where they were going. It was just, let's hope this set of tyres works and this warm-up procedure works. And George will be there tomorrow. I mean, talk about a good sprint racer is George Russell. So, yeah, we'll see tomorrow how Mercedes are as we go into qualifying as well. But they don't look bad. They don't look bad at all. Yuki Tsunoda again looked very good in the Racing Bulls, significantly more composed than Isaac Hadjar, who at least got into Q2. But then overdriving in these tyres, on these tyres, bit like Liam Lawson, the Q2 just got away from him. Alex Albon, good job. This time, Carlos Sainz, welcome to Williams after all those years at Ferrari, Carlos. Never got the balance right, never felt confident in the car, and was also complaining about the seat feeling loose when the car was getting a little bit light, which is a terrible feeling, I would imagine. So, as I say, welcome to reality, Carlos. Let's hope he gets it right as the weekend progresses. And then Lance Stroll, good job. He did a good job in Melbourne to upstage Fernando Alonso. And again, he's done the same thing. Not only did he out-qualify Fernando, but in Q3, I guess he wasn't expecting too much, but he ran a scrub set of softs, which again shows that Aston Martin using their brains. And to some extent, Lance Stroll using his brain as well and saving a set there too. So good job by Stroll to do that time on scrub softs. Another good performance I thought was Oliver Behrman, who had a diabolical Australian Grand Prix, even though he did get a few miles under his belt in the race in the wet. No real errors in the race. And he carried that momentum through, always looked pretty good and comfortably into Q2. Good job. Nico Hulkenberg didn't get out of Q1. There was lots of traffic, of course, in Q1. Usual thing, traffic, gusts of wind, tyres not working. But Oliver Behrman was kind of on top of it. Long corners, late braking, but he's got a lovely touch. There's no doubt about that. Alpine-Renault had a terrible day. Couldn't get the tyres to work. All the usual stuff we've just been talking about. Jack Doohan, though, slightly ahead of Pierre Gasly, so that won't have hurt his position at all, even though he lost time in the first practice session. Red flag came out when the power steering went on his car. And Gabriel Bortoleto did a good job in the other Sauber to get into Q2, as did Isaac Hadjar and the other Racing Bulls. He also made it through to Q2. And in the results of a poll after the Australian Grand Prix, the majority of Formula One fans thought it was quite understandable that he was so upset after his shunt on the formation lap, and that his reaction was not in any way unbecoming that of a 2025 Formula One driver. So we look forward to we can't look forward to the sprint race tomorrow. It'd be interesting to see how McLaren go relative to Ferrari and Red Bull. It'd be interesting to see if Red Bull can beat Ferrari. And it'd be interesting to see on his second public outing for Ferrari, whether Lewis Hamilton, having got his first pole sprint race, can now actually win the sprint race as well. Worth seeing. So tomorrow a sprint race, and then later on in the day, qualifying from China. See you then. Well, it continued through into Saturday. Maybe it's the new track surface, maybe it's the gusts of wind, maybe it's the heat. I think Oscar Piastri used the right word when he said, yeah, a couple of the laps are a bit scruffy. Scruffy it was. Lots of unanswered questions in many ways. I think the first, of course, is to continue to acknowledge the incredible grip and downforce that the McLaren-Mercedes enjoys at the moment. On this occasion, it was Oscar Piastri that got the best from it, and he got the pole. Brilliant pole. His first pole, amazing. I thought he probably had about 4 by now. Yeah, first proper pole for Oscar Piastri, so congratulations to him. But that reflected, I think, more the poor weekend so far that Lando Norris has had. Not a great day yesterday on Friday. It looked a bit scratchy in the car, didn't qualify well for the sprint race, didn't race well either in the sprint race, got bogged down, ran wide on the first lap, and then got trapped in traffic for the entire sprint race. Didn't do much for his confidence, for sure. Made a few changes to the car, as they would going into qualifying. It's out of parc fermé for that period. But he still didn't look great in the car. And his quickest lap in Q3, the lap should have put him at least on the front row of the grid, if not on the pole, went away when he just went too quickly into the hairpin and ran wide, and that was it. He just drove straight back into the pit lane. So a lot of mistakes from Lando Norris. But then he's the driver I've been saying, certainly been saying after the Australian Grand Prix, with the sort of touch he has, the sensitivity that he has, he should always be able to put it over Oscar Piastri, so long as Oscar continues to drive more or less like Lando Norris. Well, today that didn't happen. And I think it's quite significant that the first two positions on the grid, Oscar Piastri and then George Russell in the Mercedes, are taken by two drivers who are wide entry, fairly late braking, and right on the edge of what they want to achieve at any given moment. And that manifested itself in various different ways. I guess I'm getting around to saying I don't think we saw the best from the McLarens today. And had Lando been driving as Lando normally does, I think he probably would have been quicker than Oscar Piastri. But because he just had he's had two bad days, it was Oscar Piastri that got the pole in what is quantifiably still the best car out there. So again, that's not to detract from Oscar. It's just to try to explain, for example, how near George Russell came to getting the pole, and to explain also how Lewis Hamilton, with a great lap yesterday, a great clean lap that got him the pole just from Max Verstappen, parlayed that into the win that we talked about last night. Amazing for Lewis Hamilton to lead from the pole and lead the sprint race from start to finish. Helped a little bit by Max challenging for a while, and just when he was on the point maybe of passing Lewis in DRS, very similar top speeds between the Red Bull and the Ferrari, his front tyres went away. So he then systematically fell back into the clutches of Oscar Piastri. And by the time Oscar had got past him, he had overused his tyres and he couldn't do anything about Lewis. That's, again, it's not to detract from Lewis's achievement, but that's how the race panned out. So brilliant for Lewis Hamilton to win that race. But it kind of explains why it's all looking so close. And I suppose we'll never know whether it's the track surface, the heat, or other things that are coming into play, the wind, for example, in China. What we can say is that there were characteristics of the two laps that resulted in the front row in qualifying. And one comes under the heading of my love of turn 7, that very, very quick left-hander. Uphill approach, then it just falls away downhill before they go into the left-hander there. And definitely there you can see a Max Verstappen turning in earlier than most. You can see a Charles Leclerc turning in earlier than most there as well. But what was impressive, I thought, was that by my count, only 4 drivers were absolutely flat in 7th, which is over 5G lateral going into turn 7 today. And they were the 2 McLaren drivers, Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, would you believe, in the other Ferrari. Everybody else had a slight lift going into 7. And sometimes it really worked. For George Russell, that worked perfectly. And maybe it meant that his tyres were just in perfect shape for the last sector, because he just saved that little bit of energy there. So it's worth noting that Lando Norris, on the lap that he aborted, was absolutely flat through turn 7 as well, like Oscar. But then there was a difference between Oscar and Lando at the point where Lando made his mistake, which was at the end of the main straight, having gone through the speed trap. Very similar top speeds. Oscar Piastri, absolutely brilliant, I thought, in braking for the hairpin. I was going on in Australia about how good Lando was into turn 4, high-speed braking there. Very different set of circumstances in terms of what the track is like there, the corner you're going into, the conditions, the ambient, everything else. Different tyres as well, of course. Here, going into the hairpin, Oscar Piastri takes a little bit of speed out of the car, 15 kilometres an hour, 330 down to 315, without even touching the brakes. He's got the car nice and settled, and then he goes for the brakes. Absolutely beautiful. Lewis Hamilton, by contrast, did it a different way, and he's very, very good under high-speed braking as well. Lewis is absolutely flat on the throttle, and then when he gets to the braking area, for a millisecond, he puts his foot on the brake, but doesn't actually slow the car down. He's got pedal. He's absolutely feather-light touch on the brake pedal pressure, settling the car, and then he brakes hard. Two different ways of doing it. Just superb. George Russell was all about perfect synchronization between brake and throttle. So the millisecond he comes out of the throttle, he's on the brakes, like Max Verstappen. Very different approach again. But I thought it was really interesting that the two drivers on the front row of the grid had the two lowest minimum speeds in the middle of the hairpin, 65 kilometers an hour. Lando Norris obviously went in too quickly. It was like 71, 72 kilometers an hour. That was the slowest he ever got. But it's significant, is it not, that it's breaking down into that very, very slow minimum speed. And high minimum speed in the hairpin doesn't gain you any ground whatsoever. I should add, actually, there was one other driver who I saw was flat through turn 7, and that was Alex Albon in the Williams. Really, really good. Obviously, the car, very difficult to get the Williams to work all around the lap, but through turn 7, flat, absolutely, just like the two McLaren drivers. Very impressive from Alex Albon there. Anyway, getting back to George Russell, he does have a lift going into 7. And he also did two other things differently from everybody else on his quick lap. And he was doing it for most of the weekend, indeed. Through the turn 1, 2, 3 section, at the slowest point of that, when they're going around that little left-hander, George is the only driver that I saw going back to second gear. Everybody else in third, including Antonelli, in third through there, which is characteristic of George. Just wants to get on top of the car, a few more revs, just control the back end. So that I'm not sure many other drivers could actually be quick if they'd used second gear there, but George, it just perfectly matched the way he drives. And he did the same thing going into it in turn 6, tight right hander, preceded by the longish straight in which they're in 7th gear. George goes down to second there as well. So did Antonelli at that point. So the two Mercedes are in second, but McLaren-Mercedes, Williams-Mercedes in third through there, Ferrari in third, Red Bull in third. And again, that's just classic George Russell, isn't it? Just right on top of the car. And then maybe he's just got a little bit more speed, maybe he's got a little bit more traction, but then he saves the tires. Maybe that's why he's doing it. I'm sure George wouldn't like to hear, oh, he spooked himself out going into 7. He just lifts slightly going into 7, like Lewis, compared with Charles, who's absolutely flat. And it's interesting, isn't it? Both Lewis and George, very, very quick in sector 2, but they both lifted going into 7. So here I am going on about the tough guys who are flat through 7. Well, we've got to enjoy ourselves sometimes, and it's just amazing to hear that engine there, wow, in through 7 over 5G lateral. Really impressive corner. And Oscar Piastri just on rails through there. Amazing to watch. So it was all, lots of things going on. Slightly different selection of gears in some cases. Use of turn 7, how they went into the hairpin. It eventually came down to who lost the least time on the slow corners, which is to say turns 1, 2, and 3, and that, well, once you're through the entry to 1, and then of course the hairpin at the end of the lap. The other thing I just say about George, the incredible thing about George's lap and how good it was that he knew he was quick, obviously, on that lap, and it's so tempting, especially a reflexy driver like George, to maybe break a fraction too late into the hairpin, but he didn't. He was absolutely disciplined, and we saw that in some of his radio messages today. There was a moment I think it was in Q1, when there was a bit of a panic because he hadn't got through into the top 15 at some point, and I don't know what was going on, but I mean, he did the time easily, of course. Then he got on the radio in the break between Q1 and Q2 and said, guys, just stay calm. We should stick to the plan. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. No stress. And I just thought that was really nice. A little bit of a contrast to the sort of frenetic stuff we heard from Lewis in Melbourne. But of course, very different Lewis today in China, having won the sprint race, and Ferrari kind of on top of things. The other thing to say about Ferrari, just going on, I mean, Lewis did a good job today, probably got the best from the car. I think the Ferrari's quite a good all-round car. Nothing like the same grip as the McLaren, as we know. But Lewis did a good job to get the best from it. And Charles Leclerc actually quicker than Lewis in Q1 and Q2 and not far away in Q3. So he really picked himself up. He said at one point before Q3, I think he said we need to focus on the entry to turn 6, which is that right-hander, the tight right-hander I was just talking about, where George is in second and he's in third. But I'm not sure he was right there. I think more he needed to focus on whether he should be saving the tyres through 7 and giving himself more grip in the final sector, going into the hairpin and stuff like that. And Charles overall not dramatically quick anywhere, but pretty good everywhere. And you just get the feeling he's probably going to have half a reasonable race tomorrow. Usually goes quite well in the race when it's difficult, when deg is the big catchword of the day. So we look at the grid then. We got Oscar Piastri on the pole, And in a race where tyre deg is going to be absolutely critical, it's a bit like the wet, really. If you're in front, you've got a serious advantage. And he can control the pace, and he doesn't have debris or any of that stuff, turbulence on the tyres. And he can look after the tyres much more efficiently than if you're in traffic. So it's a double whammy, this pole, I think, in China. Assuming he can get the lead going into the first corner, which I'm sure he will. George Russell on the dirty side of the grid, P2. He's going to struggle with tyre deg for sure. He'll be pushing Oscar pretty hard in the early laps, knowing George, assuming Oscar takes the lead, and that will be tough on his tyres. And Mercedes already will be saying, look, if you're P2, make sure you look after the tyres. Anyway, it'll be that sort of race. And Lando will be behind him, probably with more chance to manage the tyres. He won't be able to do as good a job with tyre management as Oscar if Oscar's in front. But he will be, because they've got more grip at McLaren, they can use the tyres more efficiently. And so he'll be pushing George hard. And then we've got Max, who would be disappointed, I think, to be P4 in qualifying. And as I say, in the sprint race today, it just showed the shortcomings of the Red Bull right now. Just nothing like the same grip as the McLarens, and probably not quite as good as the Ferrari right now. So yeah, a difficult day. I mean, Max, I think, got the best from that car. Not much more he could have done. Pretty good laps, but and they're pretty quick on the straight, which is a good thing. And that's why it took Piastri so long to get Max on the straight in the sprint race. But he's going to have a tough race tomorrow, I think, even to beat George Russell. It's going to be pretty close between Red Bull and Mercedes, and then he's going to have at least one, if not both, Ferraris around him as well. So Max would have wanted to have been on the front row just to try to get away from everybody, but where he is, it's not going to be that easy for him. Lewis will be absolutely delighted with the way things have gone, and to be starting ahead of Charles Leclerc as well is a nice little bonus for him. Charles has just been in a weird situation. He did make up a lot of ground. He just didn't get the lap perfectly, and we've seen weekends from Charles like this, and usually when he has terrible qualifying like this, he does, as I say, get it together in the race. So we'll see what happens there. Isaac Hadjar, superb job in the Racing Bulls to be 7th after everything that happened in Melbourne, and then to put it together like this and drive that well. There were two key moments for me in Isaac's lap, and one was going into the last corner, where he was off brakes and throttle just for a millisecond, just to let the car settle, as indeed Lando was when he was not making mistakes. And then he did the same thing, turn 2-3 on the slow bit there. He's just letting the car settle beautifully. Just really nice. Obviously backing off a little bit through 7. Why wouldn't you? As was Yuki Tsunoda. But really nice to watch, and starting to confirm what we saw earlier, that he does have that feel for getting into corners a little bit earlier as well. A little bit, as I used to say about Oscar versus Lando, assuming Oscar can build on his short corner talent, that's the way he's the only chance he's got of beating Lando, unless Lando has an off day. I say Lando has an off day. Let's just think about that. I don't think Lando had an off day. It's because he does turn in quite late, and he does brake quite late and all those things. He's got the great touch. We know that. He does come out of the brakes and throttle beautifully. But it does put him right on the edge when it's one of these fractious weekends of tyre degradation and gusts and heat and getting the tyres to perform and slow on the straight. All those things combined make it very difficult if you are relying on a very late wide turn in and late braking going into that, of course. And that's what we're seeing, an early throttle application. Antonelli did a very good job, but definitely backing off more than George through 7. I say George lifted into 7. He just lifted slightly, whereas Antonelli backed off big time into 7, for example. And as I said, that's at the moment, it's the fast corners that are a problem for Antonelli. Not a problem. That's where he's going to hopefully make the most improvement from his perspective. But on the slow stuff, look really, really good. Right on top of it. Very, very good indeed. Yuki Tsunoda, well, we know how good he is. And Alex Albon, I've already said, wow, flat into turn 7 as well. Other performances, Esteban Ocon did a good job, I thought, to get the Haas into P11, having had a bad Melbourne and really a bad weekend up until now. So that was good. Nico Hülkenberg made up for yesterday to get into Q2 as well in the Sauber. Both Aston Martins failed to make it out of Q2. Fernando on this occasion just ahead of Lance Stroll, and Carlos Sainz considerably slower than Alex Albon, struggling again with when all these variables come into play. Really difficult for a guy like Carlos in a new team, in a new car, obviously not a brilliant car either in terms of consistency of balance and grip around the lap, to stay on top of it. Late breaker, wide turn in driver that he is. Pierre Gasly didn't make it out of Q1, but did have a very good racy sprint race today. He passed quite a lot of cars, looked quite good, but that experience didn't really result in a decent qualifying performance, so disappointing for them. Oliver Behrman, P17, Jack Doohan, yeah, both of them had their issues. Bortoleto, and then Liam Lawson, again, absolutely out of his depth in the second Red Bull. Again, this highlights how difficult that car is and how good a job Max Verstappen's doing in that car. That's the first point. But secondly, he is, I find it absolutely extraordinary that in his post-race comments, he's talking about, I'm still confident, I just need to be quicker. That's not the way. I mean, the way is to think about why he's slow. And the reason he's slow, in my opinion, is because he's nothing but a late-braking, oversteer, wide turn-in driver who's never going to be flattered, as we saw with Carlos Sainz, in conditions like this. And Carlos struggling for exactly the same reason that Liam Lawson's struggling, just more so because Liam's much more inexperienced, and I presume the Red Bull even more difficult to drive than the Williams. So, he, instead of saying, I'm very confident, I just need to go faster, I need to get through this stage, he should be saying, I need to start working on, shorter corners and giving myself a bigger platform, a bigger palette on which to operate with all these variables that come into play. And I'm going to learn about that from Max Verstappen and doing lots of work behind the scenes, presumably with somebody like Rob Wilson. I can't think of any other solution. Of course, there will be moments coming up when Liam Lawson will be quick, when he has a decent amount of grip, decent amount of balance. And of course, we know he's got great car control. But it's these moments when all the variables are against him that it's not good enough just to say, I need to be quicker. That's not the answer. The answer is he needs to start shortening the corners and giving himself a much bigger margin in which to operate amongst the variables. And he's never done that in his life. All he's ever done is driven with the rear of the car, never the front. And that's, but then again, you say, well, Red Bull must know that. They must have known that when they decided to replace Sergio Perez. They must have thought, well, we're sick of having this guy who's so good on traction but not very good on understeer. We want a guy that can really throw the car around when he's got understeer. We'll get Liam Lawson. But did they say to themselves, well, in that case, what are we going to do if it's like it is in China, as it is in China or was in Melbourne? All those variables in there, the wet, the wind, the heat, whatever it is, the tyres degging. What's he going to do? Probably in this situation, Perez would have got more out of the car because he would have been much kinder to the rear tyres. I know it's the front tyre here that's an issue, but he certainly would have done a good job with the rear tyres. Anyway, it just strikes me, I'm having a bit of a rant, but it just strikes me, if you're going to replace a driver, know the driver that you are bringing into the team intimately, the way he drives. Don't just think, oh yeah, he's really quick and he's got a great handshake and looks cool in this jacket or whatever they're thinking. We know Liam Lawson's quick, but he's only quick if he's got a massive amount of grip and balance, and then he can be a real racing driver. But, when it's finessey, and then I guess the final comment is that I've been going on all winter about Lando Norris's biggest problem is not, has he got the mentality to take the race to a Lewis Hamilton or a Max Verstappen or a George Russell? Lando Norris's biggest problem throughout 2025, as I've been saying, is always going to be Oscar Piastri. And Oscar is not slow. He's still not as quick as he could be, but he's not slow at all, as we saw today. A fabulous lap by Oscar Piastri. And that is the biggest problem for Lando Norris in terms of winning the 2025 championship. The guy who's in the same car as he is beating him. And it's going to be difficult for him tomorrow. Oscar from the pole. And it's actually, from McLaren's point of view, it's worked out as well as could be expected because they don't have this problem of how to sort out the battle between Oscar and Lando, because by the time Lando gets free of George and Max, which in theory he will, Oscar will be long gone and his tyres will be in better shape anyway, in theory. So yeah, that solved that problem for McLaren for the weekend. So yeah, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, that is the battle. And we have a battle now. Oscar did that lap, and Lando so far has driven with too many mistakes this weekend, given the style that he has and how good he is. So there we go. See what happens tomorrow. Should be a fascinating race. See you then. Please note that as we were processing our Sunday analysis coming up next, it was announced by the FIA after scrutineering that both Ferraris and Pierre Gasly's Alpine-Renault had been disqualified for technical infringements for being underweight in the case of Charles Leclerc and Pierre Gasly, and for a floor ride height infringement in the case of Lewis Hamilton. Well, the race ran out pretty much as predicted. I guess the only thing that was a real shock was how well Lando Norris got off the line. well, he moved up to P2 right behind Oscar Piastri before everyone had blinked, really. And that was because it was a telling moment. He went around the outside, did a really good pass going into one, got all these positions there. Interestingly, and I think this was a defining moment of the Chinese Grand Prix in many ways, Max Verstappen opted to do exactly the same thing, go around the outside, basically where Lando was. But as soon as Max tried to do that, you saw the back end of the Red Bull jink. He had to come out of the power and then he lost position. And that was the difference. That was the grip level of McLaren versus the grip level of Red Bull on semi-warm medium tyres going into the first lap of the Chinese Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri in front, Lando Norris P2. As I said yesterday in the video, it was always going to be an easier race for Oscar in that position. I imagined that it was going to take Lando a little bit longer to get up to P2. But having got there was always the problem of dirty air. It was the problem of damaging the front tyres. And Oscar, by contrast, having a clean road and being able to do much more with his tyre management. As it happened, Oscar had a trouble-free race in terms of any mechanical dramas in the car. The pit stops were perfect. Everything was right. And he controlled the race beautifully and won justifiably from the pole. The only time he didn't lead was when Alex Albon was out in front of the race in the Williams Mercedes, running a really long first stint and driving very well, as we mentioned yesterday. But for Lando Norris, it was a different situation. For most of the race, he was within 2-3 seconds of Oscar Piastri. He was asking at one point on the radio, and he got a response for Oscar to go a bit quicker so they can have a bit of a cushion. They were urging Lando to save it all for the last phase of the race, the last 10 laps or so, when if he had fuel, if he had tyres, he could have a bit of a race with Oscar. But that all went away when Lando's car developed a major brake problem. Retardation was no issue initially. It was in the last couple of laps, but the brake pedal was just getting longer and longer. And of course, that's very disconcerting for any racing driver, even Lando Norris. And so Lando backed away, cruised into second place. Great win for McLaren, a 1-2, even with a mechanical problem, and even with Lando not starting on the front row of the grid. Of course, this does raise other issues as we go forward. We've had 2 Grand Prix now. The first one by Lando, obviously. The second by Oscar. A little bit like the old McLaren Can-Am days, the Bruce and Denny days. And as I said, all winter, the biggest problem Lando Norris has got this year, if he's to become world champion, is how he's going to beat Oscar Piastri. And on this circuit, at this weekend, with Lando not having a very good Friday or Saturday, and Oscar, by contrast, starting himself in really well, the race is on between these two. And Formula One fans, I think, can sit back and savour what we're going to see ahead. But from McLaren's point of view, it's nothing like as clean as when, say, Ferrari had a dominating car with Michael Schumacher and they always had a Rubens Barrichello or Felipe Massa in the other car. Not that they were slow, it's just that we know the contractual obligations they were under. That's not the case at McLaren. There's going to be a lot of racing. And one thing's for sure, having smelt the red meat, now Oscar Piastri is going to be thinking World Championship. He's a racing driver, and of course, that's going to be in his blood. George Russell, excellent P3 for Mercedes, drove really well, looked after the tyres. It was not an easy race in terms of tyre management, but he was a strong third throughout. And in the early phase of the race, quickly pulled away from the Ferraris and Max Verstappen. So really good drive by George, well deserved. Mercedes and George also drew the praise of Charles Leclerc, who was closing on George at one point before the tyres went away, 2/3 of the way through the race, talking about how good the Mercedes traction was on that long right-hander leading onto the back straight. So that augurs well for Mercedes as we get to the next phase of the circuits. Lots of traction episodes and circuits coming up throughout the year, really. So that's a really good sign for Mercedes. And looks like they've got a pretty good grip and balance as well on the car. Not in the McLaren class in terms of overall downforce, but nonetheless a big step forward from where they were last year. Something that Lewis Hamilton, although he did win the sprint race, should never forget that yesterday, will probably be thinking about on the flight home how good the Mercedes is now relative to McLaren. As for Ferrari, a disappointing day, you can say. I think the car was probably better than the results looked. Lewis Hamilton, on the back of that sprint race, buoyed up, confident, was actually not that impressive in the race. He didn't seem to have anything wrong with the car. There was that incident with Charles Leclerc, going into a second on the opening lap, but I don't think it damaged his car. But he was under pressure from Charles for a lot of the first phase of the race, and then ceded position to Charles, and was then asking on the radio where he could pick up a bit of pace, and eventually came in for a second set of hard tyres towards the end of the race. So he lost grip. He lost a lot more grip than Charles Leclerc, even though Charles Leclerc, off the line, and qualified alongside Lewis, remember, even though Charles Leclerc on the second corner of the lap, which is effectively the tightening part of turn one, had a collision with Lewis. Now, whether this is a portent of things to come as the season progresses, put two drivers like that together and there's always going to be an issue for sure, as we've been talking about for many, many months now. Charles Leclerc was down the inside going into two, going very well, very good start, did well. Lewis is on his outside on the left, taking his wide approach into turn two, and just came across in front of Charles and took off Charles' left front wing end plate. And both drivers, interestingly, said, "I've just been hit." They didn't actually say they'd been hit by their teammate. And Charles continued, lost a bit of momentum, obviously, but he was behind Lewis. But then very quickly showed that he had just as much pace as Lewis, if not more, even though he didn't have a front wing end plate, left front wing end plate. About 20 to 30 points of downforce lost. And bear in mind, a lot of the corners in Shanghai are right-handers. And I guess, you know, that's where that front wing end plate would have more, the loss of it would have more impact than through a left-hander. And so Charles, got to say, drove absolutely superbly. The big question mark is why they didn't change the nose section in his one and only pit stop. It was a one-stop race for most of for all the front runners and for most of the other runners. They didn't change the front wing, and he did the whole race with that broken front wing. And that's because with the new nose on the Ferrari, the way it is, it would have been too much time loss. And he wasn't actually that much slower anyway, which I guess is a bit of a question mark for the aero department in Ferrari. He can be that quick without a front wing end plate on the car. Maybe the front wing end plates aren't doing what they should. Anyway, they're pretty templated there anyway by the regulations. So it was a great drive by Charles. He got past Lewis when they told Lewis to cede position, which obviously Lewis didn't want to hear. The winner of the sprint race, confident, full of confidence, surprised that he's not quicker, surprised that Charles all over him. And he responded, as racing drivers do, well, time to get a bit closer, even though at that stage Charles was in DRS zone. But then he did let him pass going into the hairpin a lap or two later, and Charles pulled away. At which point Lewis got on the radio, says, "Okay, tell me where I'm losing ground, where am I slow?" And they talked about a few things. They talked about an exit here or a turn in there. But of course, the reality was, watching the two of them closely together, Charles' short corners were pronounced compared with those of Lewis Hamilton. Well, zero from Lewis Hamilton. It was all wide turn in, braking in a straight line, get the power on as soon as possible. It was as if it was Carlos Sainz driving that Ferrari almost. Carlos, towards the end of his Ferrari career, was beautifully smooth, these inputs. So yeah, very, very similar to watching Carlos Sainz in the car, the way he drives. And no wonder Charles was getting more out of the car. Charles, a confident Charles now, and understanding how to drive the car around Shanghai, was getting much more out of the car. And more importantly, not using anything like as much rubber as well, not using as much Pirelli tyre in doing that. So it was a marked contrast to everything we saw on Friday and superficially the results of the sprint race. On Sunday, Charles Leclerc, with a broken front wing, all over Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari. So although Lewis will go back thinking, yeah, won the sprint race, mega, he'll also go back thinking, what happened on Sunday? So yeah, a strange race for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc nearly got within striking distance of George Russell, but then the tyres started to go away. He went into the hairpin a couple of times a bit too quickly and dropped away to finish fourth. Lewis Hamilton fifth. They brought him in for a second set of hard tyres. I thought that was a rather strange decision as well, because Oliver Behrman in the Haas had done really well with his one-stop strategy, starting on the hard and then running a really long stint on the mediums, and he was competitive right through to the end of the race. I think the problem was for Lewis, they brought him in because his tyres were going away. The problem was they didn't have any mediums left for him. He obviously got within striking distance of Charles, but he was never going to be able to repass Charles. There was not enough time. And Esteban Ocon, almost unnoticed, didn't get a lot of TV time. Absolutely brilliant with his drive in the Haas Ferrari into P7. Kimi Antonelli drove very well to finish 8th in the other Mercedes, despite serious floor damage from lap 1. Alex Albon 9th on his birthday for Williams Mercedes. Another beautiful drive. He's really going well in that car. Carlos Sainz, meanwhile, in the other car. As I say, it was reality check day yesterday, even more so today, racing with the Alpines and just racing with everyone in the back of the midfield. Not what Carlos Sainz, I guess, ever imagined would be the case at Williams. But right now, that's where he is, and he doesn't look as sharp in the car, doesn't look as sublimely quick in the car as Alex Albon. So as I said at the time, when he decided to go to Williams, I thought that would be a mistake because above all, he's got to beat Alex Albon in that car. That was never going to be easy. And I can't imagine Carlos Sainz enjoyed his day of Formula One at all in China, or his 3 days of Formula One in China, because he had 3 bad days. And then finally, 10th into the points, Oliver Behrman drove really well. Forget about Australia. Just a great drive by Oliver Behrman on those medium tyres, passing people, saying ciao every time he passed one. Nigel Mansell-esque sort of, down the radio. Nigel would say, as if he was half asleep, something like, come on, out of the way, thank you. And Oliver Behrman was just ciao. Well, after all, of course, he has driven for Prema for quite a long time, so I guess his Italian's quite good. So yeah, great drive to have, and great result for Haas to have both cars in the points as well. Something that could not be said of the likes of Aston Martin, who lost Fernando Alonso very early on when the brakes set themselves on fire. Lance Stroll drove very well, I thought. Long stint. Didn't get back into the points, but he was aggressive and he was there making the tyres last for a long time. He eventually finished 12th. Pierre Gasly 11th in the Alpine. Yeah, Alpine were there or thereabouts. Scratchy race for Jack Doohan in traffic, got a few penalties. Pierre, very resistant when anyone was behind him. But of course, in these days of DRS, you can only do that for a lap or two. So Alpine's still a long way to go in terms of grip and balance and making the tyres last. Isaac Hadjar had qualified so well, faded a little bit in the race, while his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who had also been really good on Friday and Saturday, had a really strange element break on the front wing on the straight, just broke away. Very unusual to see that, given that a lot of that front wing is a templated design. So as I say, it's a little bit like the old Can-Am series, for those that can remember it, the Canadian-American Challenge Cup, when the beautiful McLaren M6s, M8s used to go out and dominate orange McLarens. They're orange again now, which is good to see. And it was either Bruce or Denny or Bruce, and they'd race one another. I don't think they ever actually touched one another. They never really had any dramas, but it was incredibly close racing for a long time. And I think that's what we're going to have in 2025. So roll on the next round of the World Championship in Suzuka. Can't wait for that wonderful circuit. McLaren will absolutely fly there, but a really interesting battle looming between Oscar and Lando. That's in 2 weeks' time, but we'll be doing some live streams and other video between now and then. Looking forward to that. Thanks for watching. Take care. A big thanks to Jetcraft, the world's largest buyer and seller of executive jets, to OEM Exclusive, the passionate suppliers of OEM upgrades for exotic and high-performance vehicles, to TrackNinja, a lap timer and data app designed to help users improve their on-track car and driver performance through analysis and an innovative data garage, and to Oscar Razor, Australia's highly rated 5-blade razors for men and women. And watch out for the first edition of Grande Preuve, your quarterly Formula One Super Slick mag, brought to you by Oscar Razor.